come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. And before I deliver my opening remarks, I wanted to note that today the committee is meeting both in person and virtually. I want to announce a couple of reminders to the members about the conduct of this meeting. First, members and staff who are attending in person may choose to be masked, but it is not a requirement. However, any individuals with symptoms, a positive test, or exposure to someone with COVID-19 should wear a mask while present. Members who are attending virtually should keep their video feed on as long as they are present in the hearing. Members are responsible for their own microphones, so please keep your microphones muted unless you are speaking. Finally, if members have documents they wish to submit for the record, please email them to the committee clerk, whose email address was circulated prior to the hearing. Well, good morning to our witnesses and to our attendees. It's great to be here in a field hearing in Woodridge. I think the last time I was here was following the tornado. A somewhat less happy time here, and I'm really proud to be back here in more pleasant circumstances. And I'm thrilled to be meeting on a transformational technology issue. The United States has at last reached that storied tipping point for affordable, high-quality electric vehicles. The whole world is reaching for their wallets, and the 11th District of Illinois is answering the call. Rivian is at this very moment ramping up production of electric passenger and delivery trucks at its factory in Normal, and Lion Electric is readying for installation of production machinery at its electric bus factory in Joliet. I should point out here that battery electric vehicles are not the only game in town, or more literally in this area, for low emission fleets. Hyzon Motors is manufacturing hydrogen fuel cells for commercial vehicles in Bolingbrook. And the internal combustion industry is not sitting still. Traditional trucks and buses have been diesel powered with fossil fuels, which means that they have a higher emissions profile for nitrous oxides and soot than gasoline powered vehicles. Clear Flame Engine Technologies in Geneva, in collaboration with Argonne, has developed low emission diesel engines that run at full thermodynamic efficiency, powered by low carbon biofuels such as corn ethanol, which opens the door not only to low emissions long haul trucking, but tractors, harvesters, and a full line of farm equipment that run on fossil fuel-free biofuels that the farm industry itself produces. So demand for low emission vehicles is booming, and our local economy will reap the harvest. And as clean truck and bus revolution is not just an opportunity for Illinois, but for a safer climate and cleaner air around the globe. An electric bus on one hand doesn't really emit anything at all during operations and allows clean sources of electrical generation to contribute to decarbonization of the transportation sector. Electric fleets will enable massive improvements in urban air quality and help protect public health. Furthermore, over the life of the vehicle, the average EV has less than half of the carbon footprint per passenger mile than an equivalent internal combustion engine vehicle. And the environmental profile of EVs only gets better over time as grid operators replace more and more fossil fuel plants with zero carbon alternatives. So there's a lot to be excited about here. Let us not forget that decades of dedicated research have led to this moment. It is no accident that the global transportation sector is changing. Cost-effective, lightweight, and long-duration batteries that last more than a decade are the key. And they were developed over time by hardworking scientists and engineers with a very specific vision, many of them toiling up the street at Argonne National Lab. I'm proud to count some of those friends as my constituents. Now is not the time to stop innovating. On the Oversight Committee for the House Science Committee, it's our responsibility to look into the technology concerns that could impede progress, and the supply chain for critical materials that go into an electric vehicle battery, lithium, cobalt, nickel, graphite, manganese, and others, may be an enormous technological and cost challenge. The problem is so large that it has even become obvious to Elon Musk, who apparently spent a good fraction of yesterday's earnings call for Tesla complaining about the high cost of lithium. Global demand for these critical minerals is surging along with electric vehicle sales and projections from automakers. The numbers are simply eye-popping. And because they have more cells in their products, Rivian, Lion Electric, and other companies that make big vehicles with big battery packs know better than anyone how mineral costs are affecting their bottom line. Unfortunately, the United States is home to almost no mineral processing or midstream fabrication for batteries. China has invested billions in these steps of the supply chain, and as a result, they hold a lot of the cards right now. One value proposition of electric vehicles has always been their potential to loosen our dependence on a global commodity, oil. Oil prices are out of the US's control worldwide, and so they create volatility in our economy and harm American families. Russia's war on Ukraine has brought to light the grave dangers of our geopolitical dependency on fossil fuels. The last thing we need is to exchange one form of geopolitical vulnerability for another. So we need to focus on alternative battery chemistries, recycling strategies that can help keep mine minerals circulating in the economy, and new methods for extraction and processing that reduce environmental impacts. I'm a technology optimist. I believe that we can engineer our way out of this problem, and the US research enterprise has a lot more battery science breakthroughs up its sleeve. So many talented scientists like Dr. Srinivasan and Dr. Armanchuk, right? Yeah, thank you. Armanchuk are committed, have committed their professional lives to the battery mineral supply chain. We have exciting companies like Rivian and Lion Electric, both contributing to that quest and providing the demand pull for new innovations. President Biden has set a goal for 2030 that half of the cars sold in the United States should be zero emissions and electric. I want to make sure that the federal researchers are laser focused on that goal and deploying all available resources. I also want the federal research enterprise to be thinking beyond 2030. So I hope that our witnesses today will be frank in their advice to the committee, and as we appreciate that decarbonizing the global transportation sector is a matter of urgency. So I thank the witnesses for joining us. Okay. So if there are members who wish to submit additional opening statements, your statements will be added to the record at this point. And at this time, I'd like to introduce our witnesses. Our first witness is Mr. Nate Baggio. Mr. Baggio is the Senior Vice President of Commercial Development at the Lion Electric Company. He has held positions at Lion as a leader in electric school bus deployments across North America and works to provide a healthy breathing environment to students, drivers, and communities. Previously, Mr. Baggio has held leadership roles within various transit projects in Los Angeles County and in the school transportation sector. Our next witness is Mr. Chris Nevers. Mr. Nevers is a Senior Director of Public Policy at Rivian. He joined Rivian in February of 2020 to help implement the policies needed to expand electrification and Rivian's role in creating a sustainable future. Prior to joining Rivian, Chris was the VP of Energy and Environmental at the Alliance of Automobile Manufacturers and worked in EPA's Office of Transportation and Air Quality and held several roles at Chrysler. His work focuses on energy, the environment, and electrification. Our third witness is Dr. Venkat Srinivasan. Dr. Srinivasan is the director of the Argonne Collaborative Center for Energy Storage Sciences, or ACCESS, and deputy director of the Joint Center for Energy Storage Research, J. Caesar, at Argonne National Lab. His research develops continuum-based models for battery materials and combines them with the experimental characterization to help design new materials, electrodes, and devices. Dr. Srinivasan previously served as the acting director of the Batteries for Advanced Transportation Technologies program and as a department head and interim director at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. Our fourth witness is Dr. Chibuaze Akmanchukwu. Dr. Akmanchukwu is a Niebuhr Family Assistant Professor at the Pritzker School of Molecular Engineering at the University of Chicago. His research is focused broadly on sustainable energy technologies. His team is especially interested in understanding electrolyte behavior in a wide variety of electrical chemical systems, such as batteries and electrocatalysis. His work has been recognized with an NSF Career Award, an ECS Toyota Young Investigator Fellowship, and the 3M Non-Tenured Faculty Award. As our witnesses should know, you will each have 5 minutes for your spoken testimony. Your written testimony will be included in its entirety in the record for the hearing. When you've all completed your spoken testimony, we will begin with questions. Each member will have 5 minutes to question the panel. And we will start with Mr. Baggio.
Thank you, Chairman Foster, Congressman Caston, Ranking Member Abernathy, and esteemed members of the committee for inviting me to speak today. As we meet here in the land of Lincoln, it reminds me of something he once said. You cannot escape the responsibility of tomorrow by evading it today. Today's discussion about this historic change in the way our great nation's transportation system moves children, passengers, packages, materials, hauls wastes, and imports and exports of goods through some of the world's busiest ports is as critical an issue as we face today. With change comes opportunity, an opportunity to take a direct role in combating climate change, creating healthy breathing environments in our communities and workplaces, reducing our dependence on overseas energy supplies, improving national security, and reducing the tax burden on our citizens. Lion is a leading and dedicated to zero-emission manufacturer of all-electric medium and heavy-duty vehicles, including school buses, urban delivery trucks, refuse trucks, and shuttle buses. Currently, Lion has delivered nearly 600 vehicles in North America, and we are about to open the largest all-electric medium and heavy-duty vehicle manufacturing site in the United States here in Illinois. At full production, this facility will produce 20,000 all-electric medium and heavy-duty vehicles per year made by American workers. This factory is on schedule to be operational before the end of this year. The transition to electric vehicles is already well underway, as EV car sales have more than doubled each of the past 3 years, even during the most significant health and supply chain crisis in our lifetime. Orders at the Lion Electric over a few years have grown by 500%, with more expected to come with the federal Clean School Bus program opening in the coming days. This program will help communities most in need with $500 million in funding for electric school buses. Funding provided and recently signed into law in the Infrastructure and Jobs Act will add another $1 billion per year over the next 5 years for new all-electric healthy school buses for children. Modern electric school buses have been taking children to school since 2016 and have been outperforming their fossil fuel counterparts. On average, the cost to maintain an electric school bus is 80% less than a diesel bus, 60% less costly to fuel. The number of parts to replace, maintain, or fail in a diesel school bus versus an electric one are approximately 10 to 1. The lithium-ion batteries in these buses have performed well as well. At Lion, we are measuring less than 0.5% of degradation of available battery energy year over year through robust use in wide-ranging climates. It is important to note that these buses, although very different technology than diesel, meet or exceed all safety requirements under federal law in each of the states in which they operate. In order for original equipment manufacturers such as Lion to continue to provide and grow the availability of EVs in the US market, a stable supply chain needs to be present. The manufacturing capacity of vehicles is robust, as is the demand for these vehicles. But content continues to be based on volatile sources, even if the vehicles are actually built in America. It is critical to partner with favorable allies such as Canada. The current Canadian federal budget includes over $2 billion in research for the implementation of funding for critical mineral mining and processing as well. Over 90% of the lithium-ion battery pack can be recycled or disposed of sustainably. The ReCell project at the Argonne National Lab is working to improve this as well. The goal is to reintroduce minerals and metals back into the supply chain, do it sustainably and cost effectively. This continued research and recycling will be a key part of keeping up with demand. As demand on critical minerals and metals intensifies in the EV era, a program of encouraging the responsible use of these valuable resources can effectively ease the burden on supply. The Federal Highway Administration just released results last month showing that Americans drive less than 40 miles per day. In very few instances do commuters need maximum range on their vehicle. The anxiety associated with range and the resulting strain on the battery supply chain can be offset with robust investment in charging infrastructure networks and public education. Thank you for the opportunity to submit these brief comments to the committee, and I invite any questions you may have for me. Thank you.
Thank you. And next is Mr. Nevers.
Chairman Foster, Ranking Member Obernolte, Congressman Casson, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the honor of appearing before you today for this important hearing to discuss ways for the United States to meet surging demand for the battery electric vehicle. My name is Chris Nevers, and I'm the Senior Director of Public Policy for Riverview and Automotive. We submitted written testimony to address some of the details of this hearing. I would like to use my oral testimony to touch on the high points and critical aspects surrounding electric vehicle batteries and the supply chain. Rivian is a US-based manufacturer of electric vehicles and chargers with vehicle production in Illinois. Our mission is to keep the world adventurous forever. Forever meaning sustainability, and sustainability in this case, meaning the electrification of all transportation. Key to accomplishing this mission are the three vehicles we now produce in Normal, Illinois: the R1T pickup, the R1S 7-seater SUV, and a commercial delivery van designed and engineered by Rivian in collaboration with Amazon. I'll note that the R1T is the first all-electric pickup in the US and won the 2022 Motor Trend Truck of the Year. In addition to producing electric vehicles, we've committed to both decarbonizing our business and helping to protect critical natural carbon sinks, complementary and necessary work that is required to address climate change. We believe the United States must make transportation electrification a priority to address climate change, remain globally competitive, and strengthen our national economic security. We support congressional action to create targeted incentives, increase efficiency with funding deployment and permitting, and overcome unnecessary burdens to EV adoption, such as state-level dealer protection laws. We also applaud Congress for its current action to strengthen our domestic semiconductor supply, and we encourage Congress to use its bipartisan work on semiconductors as a model for addressing our domestic mineral supply chain as well. As our CEO recently said in a Wall Street Journal article, semiconductors are a small appetizer to what we are about to feel on battery cells over the next 2 decades. Although the demand for EVs is robust, market penetration will be limited by supply chain constraints. The business and consumer value proposition of battery electric trucks and fleets are enormous, but battery prices have actually started to rise due to commodity pricing. Current battery cell production capacity still represents perhaps less than 10% of what the market will need in the next 10 years. To address the growing supply chain constraints, we need a whole-of-government approach to address surging critical mineral demand, starting with increasing and expedited federal support for research into exploration, new extraction and processing methods, alternative battery chemistries, and recycling. The United States has the mineral resources and industrial capability to create a fully domestic battery EV supply chain, as well as world-leading environmental standards to ensure it is built and operated ethically and responsibly. There is also strong bipartisan support for increasing existing federal investments, accelerating the deployment of funds, and removing unnecessary barriers to domestic EV adoption and battery development. These efforts will yield billions in new investment across America, create thousands of new jobs, ensure our supply chains continue to outpace consumer demand. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you. And next is Dr. Srinivasan.
Chairman Foster, Congressman Caston, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify at this important hearing. My name is Venkat Srinivasan, and I'm here representing Argonne National Lab. Let me start with the most important message I want to convey. I believe that we are at a unique moment in time where the United States can become a dominant force in energy storage technology. We have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to discover, manufacture, and commercialize next-generation storage technologies to enable a carbon-free economy, ensure our energy security, create equitable jobs that benefit everyone, and position the US as a leader in one of the most important technologies of the 21st century. Let me elaborate. Over the past decade, the cost of lithium-ion batteries have decreased dramatically by an order of magnitude. This in turn has led to a surging market demand with the increasing penetration of electric vehicles and grid-connected storage. We expect the US battery market to increase by a factor of 20 in the next decade. The growing demand for batteries has led to significant private capital flowing into the battery industry, and the Biden administration and Congress have sent a clear signal on the need to transition the country towards a carbon-free economy. This is the good news. The bad news is that our country does not have a secure supply to meet the growing demand. The supply gap stretches from minerals to materials to cells to packs. A 20-fold increase in cell manufacturing capacity is not a trivial task and takes time, money, and deep expertise. And the challenges get more acute as we move upstream, where our country will continue to depend on complicated global supply chains for the battery materials and minerals, including cobalt, nickel, lithium, and graphite. These supply chains are subject to sudden disruption, like we've seen recently. Recycling should play an important role in bridging the supply chain gap, but remains expensive and underdeveloped. The gap is not just in supply chain, but also extends into the workforce that is sorely missing to build this industry. Beyond the supply chain issues, I want to emphasize that we will still have a technology gap in this space. While lithium-ion batteries have created a world where EVs are now not a distant dream, but a reality, we still need significantly better batteries for economy-wide decarbonization. Let me give you a couple of examples. Electrifying long-haul trucks requires energy density twice that of lithium-ion that we have today. And for electric aviation, it is even harder, requiring as much as 3 to 5 times the energy density. These dramatic changes are not possible with incremental improvements to lithium-ion batteries. In summary, we have a short-term challenge. We know lithium-ion works for many applications, but we need a secure supply chain. But we also have a long-term challenge. We need leapfrog technologies that can enable a sustainable carbon-free future. To solve the short-term challenges, we suggest these 5 parallel actions. First, we should incentivize domestic mining, but do that with consideration for environmental impact, water, and energy use. Second, we should perform the R&D to reduce the cost of recycling to enhance our supply and do the kinds of research that the Resell Center at Argonne is doing. Third, we should expand the research in developing substitutes for critical materials with emphasis on earth abundance and US resources. Next, let us prioritize chemistry-agnostic R&D to ensure that the right battery is used for the right application rather than relying on lithium-ion batteries for all the applications that are out there. Last, and the final one, we need to establish international collaboration so that we're working with our allies towards our common targets. I want to emphasize that success in these 5 areas requires seamless intersection between fundamental science, applied research and development, and industrial production. Success will also require coupling the near-term actions that I've mentioned with a set of complementary long-term solutions that will be the basis of a sustainable carbon-free economy. We need storage that enables deep decarbonization that is also inherently safe, uses earth-abundant materials, lasts many decades, and it's completely recyclable. Such chemistries are not achievable with incremental improvements to today's lithium-ion batteries. Rather, a basic science approach that brings new insights into battery storage, integrates the latest tools such as artificial intelligence and machine learning, and enables accelerated discovery of novel materials, architectures, and systems will ensure long-term US leadership in this technology. The federal government has taken many bold steps in these directions. I want to call out the all of DOE and the all of government approach taken in programs like the Energy Storage Grand Challenge and organizations like the Federal Consortium of Advanced Batteries that have really pushed the boundaries. And I want to call out the Office of Science with programs such as JCESR that have provided a pipeline of ideas that can lead to a diversified set of solutions. I will close by noting that the United States has a long and rich history of innovation in energy storage with world-class expertise in fundamental and applied research. Our country continues to be a hotbed for entrepreneurship with vibrant startup culture. However, we have struggled to translate these activities into a robust manufacturing base. We now have an opportunity to reverse this trend. We should seize this moment to become the world's leader in one of the most important technologies of the 21st century. Thank you again for giving me the time to speak at this meeting. I'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you. And next is Dr. Aman Chakko.
Chairman Foster, Honorable Caston, and all distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the invitation. I am an assistant professor in the Pritzker School of Molecular Engineering at the University of Chicago, and I am honored to join the committee today at this pivotal moment in the US energy history, a moment that could define the next century. The renewable energy transition is already upon us, but we can learn from the past with other energy transitions. The advent of the internal combustion engine led to the rise of gasoline as a fuel source. Crude oil was easy to source in the US. However, as car manufacturing and deployment soared, the US became an oil importer. Dependence on foreign oil led to the oil shocks of the 1970s that made the US vulnerable. Fortunately, innovation in drilling practices, such as horizontal drilling and proliferation of natural gas, set the US on its path as the world's top oil exporter today. From this history, it is important to emphasize that innovation, rather than diversification alone, played a primary role in regaining US's energy independence. This history provides a lens with which to view the challenges that will arise in the current energy transition. Innovation focused on alternative battery chemistries beyond current lithium-ion batteries is the ultimate disruptor and path to mitigating supply chain challenges and making the US energy independent. Batteries are complex devices, but can be broken down into three primary components: the anode, the electrolyte, and the cathode. Many of the current supply chain challenges can be tied to the cathode today. Promising short-term research efforts have focused on reducing the cobalt content and increasing the nickel content in these batteries. My research group at the University of Chicago has invested heavily in designing new electrolytes that can allow these next-generation cathodes to be used. However, nickel will become an even more critical material. Hence, this strategy works only for the short term. Promising long-term research efforts focus on batteries that do not exist today. My research group is working on some of these new chemistries. Alternatives that use lithium metal as the anode have been termed the holy grail because they can double the energy that can be stored. Some battery chemistries completely eliminate the use of lithium, such as sodium-ion, fluoride-ion, calcium, and dual-ion batteries. However, these battery chemistries are plagued by lack of suitable electrolytes amid other challenges and suffer from poor understanding of the fundamental mechanism. That is why continued and increased funding appropriation for basic and fundamental research through the Department of Energy's Office of Science and the National Science Foundation is key. From the discovery of lithium cobalt oxide by University of Chicago alumnus John Goodenough to the development of lithium nickel manganese cobalt oxide NMCs at Argonne, US-based and US-led innovation in the lithium-ion battery chemistry are what led to the revolution in energy storage. However, America lagged in translating these discoveries to the marketplace and fell behind its counterparts in Europe and Asia. The recently enacted bipartisan infrastructure bill acknowledges these challenges and provides funding and incentives to US companies. Even greater efforts will be needed to translate future battery discoveries to American industry. Significant effort must be placed on training the talent and US workforce that will develop next generation batteries, build those batteries, and manufacture electric vehicles here in the US. This is an area where universities have historically shown training women and underrepresented minorities in battery science and electrochemistry is important to ensure that all segments of US society benefit from the energy transition. A curriculum that was heavily dominated by the thermochemistry of the past century will need to transition to electrochemistry for the next century. To summarize, as the US ramps up deployment of electric vehicles and battery manufacturing, it is important that the US continue to invest in fundamental research to develop alternative battery chemistries with properties that surpass that of current lithium-ion. This alternative battery chemistry strategy is a pathway for the US to regain its perch as a leader in battery technology and lead the world as it transitions. In the past, the US innovated in batteries but did not manufacture. Now we need to manufacture and continue innovating. Thank you.
Thank you. And at this point, we will now begin the first round of questions. And so the chair will recognize himself for 5 minutes. Dr. Srinivasan, you described meeting the battery challenge as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Dr. Amanchukwu said in his testimony that this moment in energy technology, quote, could define the next century. The administration and Congress have heard this call, and we have been pulling a lot of policy levers to help. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act has $7 billion in funding to support EV battery minerals programs. Dr. Srinivasan, I imagine you are familiar with all of these new funding streams, as Argonne will be a key player in carrying them out. And with those in mind, if you had to identify one key research frontier that could still use more attention and resources, what would it be?
Thank you, Congressman Foster. I will maybe point out a priority of three that might be the most important to think about. The first one, I believe it's very important for us to think hard about substitutions for nickel and cobalt in these materials. I think that in the long term, moving away from these critical materials is going to be important for us in the country to maintain the kinds of secure supply chains that we will need going into the future. The second, which is maybe equally important, is to ensure that we're able to build up the supply chain earlier in material refining and maybe on to cathode and anode materials. We do not have that, as you pointed out in your remarks. And I think it's important for us to build out that part of the supply chain to ensure that many of the cell manufacturing plants that are coming up in the recent past are able to reach a point where they can get the supply of the materials from domestic manufacturing units. And the last one is, I think, as the next 10 years, I view recycling as being critically important. And incentivizing and providing the R&D support to make recycling cost effective is going to be extremely important for us to add to the supply chain of these materials.
Thank you. Dr. Amanchuko, do you have favorite areas that you think could use more effort and attention?
Yes, certainly. Thank you very much, Congressman Foster. I think one especially important area is on innovating in battery chemistries that do not exist today. So while we are trying to deploy lithium-ion batteries, there will be the incentive to focus on solving challenges with lithium-ion batteries. But we need to anticipate the challenges of the next 10, 20 years. And that often involves funding to the National Science Foundation and the Office of Science, where there is no current target. So quote unquote pie in the sky ideas for battery chemistries. And then the second point is on talent. Who will build these batteries here in the US? Who will manufacture them? Who are the scientists that will solve this problem? This is where efforts, specifically from the federal government, on emphasizing battery science and electrochemistry to make sure that even with the demand that we anticipate, that the US can actually build these here in the US. Thank you.
Thank you. And you point out that there's a lot of technological uncertainty in what materials will become crucial. And so one of the key and difficult things that Congress faces is the need to sort of become venture capitalists and decide which minerals to invest in early. You know, China has clearly placed a big bet on lithium and first generation lithium-ion batteries and won by that early investment in minerals processing. Do you feel that more could be done to partner with the minerals processing industry, at least for the minerals that we can see are likely to be important? And what are the efficient ways to deploy federal resources there to demonstrate new processing technologies and bring them to market?
One, yes, there are certain chemistries that we know will. So the US used to be dominant. We know that there are certain chemistries that will be important. So lithium, nickel, cobalt. And the US used to dominate lithium processing actually in the early 1990s until it fell behind in terms of how to process these cheaply. And so investing in companies that already exist in fundamental science and the research that comes up with new ideas to process lithium, for example, will be important for any energy transition that we go on in the next century.
If I can quickly add a comment to this, one of the reasons why Asian countries were able to move ahead is because they had a roadmap of where they thought the market is going to be. I think it's important in the United States to think about where we think the markets are for the different transportation sectors and maybe even the grid sector. Ask what kind of chemistries might be the answer. 3 years from today, what do we need? 10 years from today, what do we need? And then start to build out the industrial base that allows us to meet those targets. A little bit of that kind of road mapping exercise is going to be crucial for us as we think about how we are going to incentivize companies to do the things that will give them a sustainable long-term future.
Thank you. And my time is up. So I will now recognize my colleague, Mr. Caston, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chairman Foster, and thanks everybody to be here. I love that we are having this hearing, and not only because it's a stone's throw from my house, and I got to see my kids before coming down here today. But I'm an entrepreneur, and I sit there and I look at these numbers. I just pulled up, and don't quote me on this, but it's on the internet, so it must be true. 2019 U.S. demand for passenger electric vehicles, 2.1 million vehicles. 2020, 3.1, 2021, 6.7. We're on this exponential increase in demand. And all of the concerns that we hear is demand is growing faster than supply. I love that kind of problem, right? We can solve that. And the fact that we're in Illinois, we've got this entrepreneurial spirit that we've not only got, the foundational research that's happened at Argonne and our universities, University of Chicago, U of I, Lion, Rivian, Navistar up the road. We've got the people who are building this infrastructure. I go to the union halls at IBW where they've got the training facilities. We're owning the future, and it's awesome. And I just love that we're doing this. And so thank you all for doing what you do and embracing that. I want to, and by the way, we also are generous. We share our wealth in Illinois. That one of the first loan program office investments was for a Sierra Technologies down in Louisiana. So you're welcome, Louisiana. We're sharing with you. I want to focus on some of the supply chain issues, and I know we got time for multiple questions, so I probably won't get all through all this first. But Mr. Nevers, I want to start with you. Your boss talked about that we've only got 10% of the supply we need for the chain. I know you've talked about expanding your supply, your production in the U.S. And I wonder, as you think about the supply chain, we've got basic materials, whether it's lithium or cobalt, where those are going to come from where the natural deposits are. We've got the first stage processing, refining.
Much as possible. Eventually, we would like it all here, and some of that can be done with not only looking at some of the Mining Act on the table right now, like 1872, but allowing and changing how we permit. And for example, right now, if someone were to stake a claim, the only way for locals to voice concern is to basically litigate. Whereas if you had I know we talked earlier about a roadmap, but if you went out and actually had a map of where the resources are and you could sell things via lease, you can get public comment up front. I think if you did that, you would fill in this supply chain, as it were, at least the raw material aspect. As far as what are they called, midstream, that could all be done here. We have refineries here, do similar things. We have the talent here. It's just realizing that, and again, once the batteries are here, keeping them here. Once they're here, they're a resource. I don't know if I answered your question there, but I can get back with you.
Yeah, no, that's great. And like I said, I know I'm going to run out of time, but Mr. Baggio, I know you guys are manufacturing in Quebec, right? I'm curious how you think about the same question.
Yeah, we have a saying at Lion Electric internally that every 1 year at Lion is like 5 years everywhere else. So when you
feel the same way about our job.
So when you look at what we're doing, because we are building a battery manufacturing plant just on the other side of the border in Quebec as well, to produce 500 gigawatt hours per year. But that's not enough to feed the factory we're building right down the street. So we are looking for additional domestic sources of these batteries. And, the outlook is good for the next 2-3 years from our standpoint of supply chain, but we can't plan a business in that short term. So I think the comment on having a long-term roadmap with measurable milestones to know that we're on track is going to be key to getting this considerable change in the way our economy works underway. And yes, the first phase is with lithium-ion, and that's a big, lengthy phase. But new technologies, new chemistries are going to have to back that up as we start to try to power ships and planes and over-the-road trucks.
Okay, see, I'm out of time, so I yield back.
Thank you. And the chair will now recognize himself for 5 minutes. Mr. Baggio, I guess we all remember the 3 R's: reduce, reuse, and recycle. Alternative chemistries will help us reduce demand for critical materials, and we can hopefully figure out how to efficiently extract and recycle minerals from old battery cells into new ones. But there's also an opportunity to reuse the entire battery pack. People are talking about taking batteries out of the EVs once they're depleted and stack them up to create a grid-scale energy storage device. Can you talk a little bit more about what Lion Electric is doing to prepare for vehicle to grid applications with your batteries?
Yes, absolutely. We have participated in 5 V2G, vehicle to grid pilot programs across the United States. And recently, as a matter of fact, yesterday, signed an MOU with the Department of Energy to more closely examine the usefulness of these batteries in a vehicle or in a grid application. So that once they come out of the vehicle, there are other opportunities to power these with other renewable sources such as wind, solar, and hydro. Again, if we are taking the batteries from these vehicles that still have considerable energy resources in them, again, there are supply chain impacts. You don't have storage companies looking for brand new lithium-ion when there is this vast resource across all of transportation, not just our vehicles, to fill that need for stationary storage.
Yeah, thank you. And it sounds like your rate of degradation of the battery is, you said 1% per year?
Half of 1% per year.
1%. That's under normal use.
That's under normal use.
Oh,
And
so it's going
most
to
of
be
that's based
200
on
years
science.
before your battery pack is ready to be sent out to pasture?
We'll
That's pretty
see. We're
impressive.
tracking
Okay.
this, but the initial results are very encouraging.
Well, so are there other things that the manufacturers of automobiles and vehicles have to do to anticipate the recycling? And I remember seeing, one of the new innovations in, I think it was Tesla, is to make the aluminum support frame for the whole thing being filled up with batteries. And I looked at that and said, boy, that's going to be hard to recycle. Whereas if you have a standalone battery pack that you can just pull out and use it, it'll be easier. Are there things that are anticipated or rules that government could set about ease of recycling that make sense to contemplate?
I'll note our batteries, our packs are modular, so you can take out the individual modules. And what's great about that is the optionality. So down the road, you could either choose to recycle or reuse whatever made most sense for you. As far as what could government do going forward, Rivian is all for extended producer requirements guided by actually the federal government. Instead of having perhaps maybe 30, 40, 50 state programs, we could see that coming. That would be a nightmare on the regulatory side. We're all for zero landfill, no battery ever going to a landfill again. That wouldn't make any sense to, because they're actually worth something now. So I don't know if you're answering your question there, but there are things that you can do, including EPR and working with some of the states, including California, some other states who are already looking at implementing warranty and battery durability requirements that we're following closely.
Do any of our witnesses know, are there other countries that are doing a better job of specifying the recycling ability of things that are hitting the market?
So right now, the European Union Battery Directive, which is under review, will set recycling requirements. Those will be effective probably for the next couple of years. I will note we are concerned there that we don't want to specify a mandated recycling percentage, just because we don't know how many recycled batteries are going to be available. If they end up lasting like we expect 10 plus years, it's going to be a while before we can get them back and put them into new batteries.
So you would prefer just sort of structural requirements on, you have to be able to remove the batteries efficiently. You have to be able to disassemble perhaps the individual cells rather efficiently.
Correct. We would look more for extended requirements on the manufacturer, either battery take back or responsibility. They're coming anyway. Let's do them responsibly.
Thank you. And my time is nearly up, so I will now yield the next 5 minutes to Representative Caston.
Thank you. Dr. Srinivasan, back in my misspent youth, I spent a ton of time working on the GREET model, trying to understand the impact of the total well-to-wheels costs, environmental impacts of various fuel choices. I wonder if you can speak. We talk in electric vehicles about the supply chain issues of electric vehicles, where it comes from, the environmental signatures, as we should. Have you guys done any analysis of how that compares to conventional vehicles? My sense is that we also need weird metals to make an engine block. And on a life cycle basis, I would assume that we use a lot more imported material to run a car for 20 years than we do to run an electric vehicle. That's an oil joke for those of you who didn't get it. Have you guys, within GREET or some other context, can you speak to both in terms of domestic content and environmental impacts of conventional vehicles versus electric vehicles?
So the GREET model has looked very carefully at both the internal combustion engine based vehicles and the electric vehicle based engines. I'll have to get back to you on details on exactly what it says about domestic versus foreign. But I will note that in general, making an electric car tends to be more environmentally, energy use wise, more than a gasoline car. And that's because much of the energy use goes into making the battery itself. As you can imagine, making a battery is a high energy process. There's a lot of high temperature heating that happens at different stages. The mining processes also take a lot of energy. The refining is actually oftentimes at high temperatures, which require a lot of heat. One of the things that we think about quite a bit in the R&D space when it comes to the refining and the mining and the making of the materials is how do you make low temperature routes for those high temperature analogs? So just as an example, if you have to heat a battery cathode material to 800 degrees Celsius for many hours to make the actual crystal structure that you need, you're going to spend the energy by doing it either from a fossil fuel source or some sort of a hydrogen source to get the kind of the heat that needs to be there. Instead, if you can find a different process, a solution-based process to make that same cathode material, then all of a sudden now, instead of using 800 degrees Celsius, you can decrease the temperature down pretty significantly. And if you can get the same characteristics or even better characteristics, then all of a sudden your total energy uses come down. So there is quite a bit of work where we've tried to link what GREET is telling us about energy use in EV batteries to try to see how to develop alternate processes so that we can find a way to decrease the total energy use. And I believe that this concept has to go upstream all the way to even the refining of materials, where we think about how much energy and water we are using so that we can develop new processes. So one of the things that we want to do is integrate GREET into all of the innovations so that we're able to continuously use that as a metric to understand, are we doing better than existing? I will get back
Can you
to you on
compare that though? Because like the domestic content, I accept we'll get back on that, but it also takes a lot of thermal and electrical energy to pump oil, to refine oil, to run a cat cracker, to distribute it. And I'm doing that every time I fill up my tank with oil, as opposed to just when I buy the car and then keep it for 13 years or whatever. How do those, just with conventional manufacturing, how do those balance out?
In conventional manufacturing, electric vehicle manufacturing is more energy used than conventional manufacturing, without taking into consideration things like the sort of extraction of oil, which is talking about making the pack itself. So then it becomes the question of what is the primary energy source? Are you going to use oil in one case or gasoline in one case, and are you using electricity? Where is electricity coming from? I think in general, all of us know that renewable electrons for powering electric cars is the best way to go. But if you can't do that, it's always better to sort of think about it in terms of going electrification, because we know that we're going to gain when we drive the electric car. Right? So it's always better.
Well, pivoting there on the electric side, I just introduced a bill with Paul Tonko 2 weeks ago, and we're hoping to get the appropriations. That I have a concern that because of this entrepreneurial challenge, we're seeing so much rising demand for electric vehicles. You don't have to grow very far before we need to build more generation. We need to build more transmission. We need to build more wires. We need to build them in the right places, which not necessarily where the loads are right now. I'm hoping to get some money to the Department of Energy to fund that, but I'm curious if you've looked at that and have some sense of, just in order to meet the market demand we're seeing, how much supply do we need to add to the grid? And by the way, let's make sure it's zero carbon supply.
Yeah, so we've looked to ask the two scenarios one can think about in the United States. One where we have a grid across the country with renewable generation at different places and maybe nuclear to add on to that, where we don't have to worry about moving electrons from place to place and we can deal with the intermittency of renewables. That scenario is expensive, but also requires us to have state rights that kind of cross state transmission lines. If that scenario doesn't work, then we have to go to the distributed generation storage concept. The latter is always going to be more expensive because there's a lot of storage you have to buy, and storage can be expensive. But in the sense of looking at this, right, if you were to go the latter route, then the amount of batteries needed for the grid is going to be another approximately 6 terawatt hour to 8 terawatt hour. If you build transmission lines, you might be much lower, maybe 2 terawatt hour to 1 terawatt hour, somewhere in that range. So we've looked at that scenario to ask ourselves what the future could be. But certainly, I think the debate is on as to whether we're going to be a transmission line built country, or are we going to go towards more distributed generation and storage.
Thank you. I yield back.
Yeah, thank you. If you can say a little bit more about that. In terms of grid storage, which is one of the things that I know both Sean and I worry a lot about, is there seem to be almost two problems. One is the day-night problem, where you're talking about a battery where you're buying cheap electricity during the day and selling it at night, or vice versa. And so that requires a battery that can hold its charge for one day, and the capital cost that gets recovered, bit by bit every day. Much more challenging is the seasonal variation, where many places in the U.S. there are 2 to 1 or more ratios of the availability of renewable energy on a seasonal basis. And that seems like it's much tougher and may lead to different technologies. Do any of you have ideas on where you think the leading chemistries and the focus of effort on that much tougher long-term energy storage problem might lead?
I can start and see what others have to think about this. And Congressman, you're exactly correct. There is a dual challenge, one that's we call the short duration challenge, anything less than 10 hours, and the long duration, which is now everything beyond 10 hours. So it can be multi-day, as you pointed out, could also be seasonal. And the challenge gets harder and harder, the longer and longer we decide to store energy. So when we take seasonal, that's probably the hardest because of the lowest cost. Estimates are that we might have to be in the order of $10 to $20 a kilowatt hour. Just to give you some numbers, today install cost is probably in the order of $250, $300 a kilowatt hour. So we're talking order of magnitude decrease in cost for those applications. In those chemistries, it's not even clear that we want to be thinking about manufacturing and pulling things out of the ground because all of that takes money. So I think we have to start looking at alternates like things like hydrogen as a means of storing energy. Unfortunately, that requires us to store the hydrogen, which means that the location matters a lot. So it's going to work in some parts of the country, not in others. We have to think about extremely low cost electrochemical storage using things like manganese and zinc and materials that we know are ubiquitous, easy to available, but also should be easy to make into a battery so that every cost is kind of cut down dramatically. We also, I think, should be thinking very, very hard about using other forms of storage, including liquid fuels, which are easier to store, and using that as a sort of a backup as we go to the future. I do think that R&D in long-term seasonal storage is going to be extremely important. As all of you know, the Department of Energy has announced the energy earth shots, in which one of them is a long duration storage shot. So I'm hopeful that as part of that, many of these ideas and more will be sort of part of the R&D portfolio.
And it's my remembrance, Sean may correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought that what they call long-term storage is a matter of weeks, not truly seasonal.
Correct. So they've defined long duration storage in the department as anything more than 10 hours. And as you know, 11 hours can be a lot easier target. 3 months is a significantly harder target. So the way I think about this is you should think about the time of storage on one axis and the cost you can have on the other axis. And the cost comes down dramatically as you start going towards seasonal, as you've
Dr. Amanchaku.
I think I'll just echo some of what Dr. Srinivasan mentioned. And I think the big part of it is innovation in chemistries. The chemistries that can do this don't exist today. So why is that a challenge? So one, electrochemical reactions that you want to control, they lead to side reactions. And so can you sustain them for weeks, months? So that's under the term of calendar life. So what's the calendar life of these new battery chemistries that have been developed? And while it is easy to see that iron and zinc are at abundance, typically nature is not that favorable, whereby they are also really difficult to make batteries or long-term batteries with. So there's a lot of innovation and science that needs to be done, but the promise is there. If we can do it, we have an electrified future.
Thank you. Now, one of the things we've done recently is that the America Competes Act is going to be authorizing large upgrades to the major user facilities operated by the Office of Science, predominantly at the national labs. And I've always felt that these facilities were crucial in that they enabled access to scientific instruments that are really outside the ability of individual universities to access. Dr. Srinivasan, could you say a little bit about how such user facilities are important for moving this forward?
Thank you for that. I'll take two things. One is the computing facilities. In the last 10 years in the battery space, the discovery of materials has been revolutionized because of computation. What used to be a PhD thesis for 5 years is now maybe within 6 months because of the computational ability to come in, accelerate discovery of materials. So it is extremely important for us to continue to use those kinds of facilities to continue discovery and accelerate that. The second one I'll call it as the advanced photon source, which is a synchrotron facility at Argonne National Lab. We use this photon source for everything from new material discovery, but also to do science on things like manufacturing. So, one thing I want to emphasize is that science comes everywhere across the supply chain. Even an applied problem can be solved using a fundamental approach. And the APS shows how to do that by looking at things like how are battery materials being made, what happens during the making of the battery material, what happens when you try to make an electrode in a battery, and try to understand the processes that occur there so that you can control them better and try to make them into something that can last a long time. So I think the user facilities will continue to play an outsized role as we think about innovation in the future.
And you spent that whole time talking about the APS without mentioning curing cancer.
Yes.
Thank you. I'll give 5 minutes for Mr. Caston.
Thank you. So, Dr. Amanchaku, don't take this personally, but you hurt my feelings when you said that we needed to transition from an education system based on thermochemistry to one based on electrochemistry. You gave me a flashback of as a chemical engineer when my former head of engineering, who was a double E, said to me, a chemie is just a double E who couldn't handle the math.
Oh.
And it was painfully true, because once we got to imaginary numbers, I was really lost. So no offense taken, but I'll get over it. I do want to ask though, how you think about sort of where we should be investing from an education perspective, because if we are making this move to electrochemistry, I suspect there's a lot more before your line that we should, your short line. What does that look like? How do we do that? And given my own experience, it's hard, right? And what do you envision we should be doing, especially at the federal level, to help facilitate that transition in our workforce?
Yeah, I am also a chemical engineer, so we can relate to that comment. So I think there are multiple approaches that the federal government can take, and one is that you need to start early. So if the benefits of the Industrial Revolution were not evenly distributed, so how do you make sure that young kids grow up to want to become scientists, and maybe especially battery scientists or electrochemists? So that's also investing in the education system, investing in training our teachers, equipping them with the skills that they need to be able to translate real-world science problems in a way that a middle schooler can understand. That takes training. Investing, I'm probably biased, but investing in early career faculty members or professors. So there are many institutions, many countries in Europe and Asia that place greater focus on ensuring that early career talent have the support that they need, because research has shown they take the most risks in terms of scientific problems. And those are the people we want solving battery-related problems. Yes, they can solve cancer-related challenges. That's great. But we also want those minds coming to battery science and electrochemistry. And then finally, ensuring that even those who come into the States, into the US to do this work, so international collaborators, can also stay here and contribute to the science that we've trained them to do. So having them leave to go back to their own countries is also a loss to the United States. How do we keep the talent that we've already trained?
Here. Question for all of you, and it follows on some of what Chairman Foster was asking about the recycling and the recycling technologies. I'm wondering how you think about this in a world where the battery chemistry is rapidly changing. And, I've been to recycling facilities that really focus on getting, chemically pure streams, eddy current field separators. I've also been to other recycling facilities where, like, some of the battery recycling facilities I've seen are sort of, powdering the cathode down and saying, we're still going to maintain the chemical composition of this thing, but put it in a pellet that can be reused. Can we even confidently predict enough about where the battery technology is going to think about what sorts of recycling facilities and technologies we should be investing in? Or do we have to wait until the technology stabilizes to think about how to make sure that we do have a robust recycling industry on the back end? For any of you who have a thought on that, I'd love to know how you think about it.
I'll maybe start off by sort of noting that I think the way the battery industry is moving, we will constantly see this sort of the stream that is coming into recycling is going to be an older material compared to the material that we want to be putting into our battery. This is a challenge that I think is going to last for a few decades. We don't have a solution for that. We've already seen this change happening with high nickel content, cobalt content materials that will be coming into the market because the batteries that were made 10 years ago are now going to have to be made into high nickel content. So, for example, in ReSol, the way we think about this is to ask, how do we convert from one form of cathode to another form of cathode, so that we are always supplying the right cathode that seems to be the one that everybody wants to use at the time, but by starting with whatever input feed shows up, because that's the one that we put into a battery 10 years ago. So I think it's going to be important for us to constantly have that. I will go back to the idea of a roadmap, though. I think if we had a roadmap of where we think things are going to be in the next 5-10 years, it gets easier to sort of plan these things out.
Congressman, I would just add, oh, by the way, I'm a chemie also, but I would just
I'll
add,
cry on each other's shoulders later.
I would add, this is a good problem to have. The fact that technology is advancing, we're not stuck in one place. This is actually the best problem you could have. So it will turn into basically another commodity tool, if you will, where a battery comes in one end and out the other end, you have a set of commodities. I think that's what we're seeing long term. And we will have time. We'll have 8 to 10 years plus based on some of the EPRs, we expect to see the extended producer requirements to adapt.
Thank you. Yield back.
Thank you. I guess as a physicist, I will refrain from quoting what physicists say about engineers, which is probably the same thing that mathematicians say about physicists. So we're probably, we know where we are on the ladder of snobbery in academia, I guess. But let's see, if we think a little bit more about, sort of the future of vehicles and the recycling strategy. There's sort of, there's a flashlight scenario where you plan on replacing the batteries many times over the lifetime of cars. Or there's the iPhone strategy where it costs so much to replace the battery, they might as well just get the next model. Where do you think the vehicle industry will be going in these? Both for frequent use vehicles like delivery trucks and also for, for consumer vehicles. One of my big worries in this is that we really want to deploy these batteries to avert CO2 emissions. And the worst thing you can do is build a big expensive battery pack that stays in the garage of some rich person. You actually want to get that battery out there and you want to charge and discharge it as many times as you can. Basically beat it to death as quickly as possible to avert the most CO2. So where do you think the trade-offs are going to be there?
Great. Well, thank you for that question, Chairman. I think there's a lot of components to that. First of all, if you want to make sure the vehicles are being used, there are other mechanisms that can be in place. For example, EPA is looking at an eRINs program as part of their RFS rule that will incentivize use. Other states also have clean fuel standards that incentivize use or displacement of conventional vehicle miles with electric miles. So that's probably the first piece. As far as how long will these vehicles last, it really depends on, I think, on the class. As you get into the medium heavy duty vehicles, you're looking at decades, and you will probably see more battery swaps than you will on light duty. With the light and medium duty, which is where our R1T and R1S are, you will probably see at least one battery swap if it were to last 15, 20 years based on our warranty that we have right now. But that's going to depend on the consumer, in the long run.
Yeah, historically, when you look at how long the vehicle's useful life is, when you look at a school bus or a Class 6 truck or a tractor.
I remember when I was a child, there was an even money bet whether the car would just rust into a pile of junk, before the drivetrain failed.
Right, and historically, older meant dirtier and more costly. But with this EV future we're talking about, the platforms in medium and heavy duty are so robust, you can run that chassis for decades, as was previously stated. So we're going to see more battery swaps once those come out. And also, when you're connecting your vehicle to the grid, you're going to see more cycles. So those batteries will have to come out sooner. It's not just based on the vehicle's duty cycle. It's going to be based on what everybody wants from that battery, including utilities. And there are instances, even in Virginia, where they are pulling the battery even before it's done with its useful life as a source of energy to make the vehicle move, because they have other plans for stationary storage and microgrid. So I think it's going to be all over the place. But the good news is older in EV doesn't necessarily mean dirtier and more costly.
If I can add a very quick comment to that, I should note, I think, because you're on the record, I'm also a chemical engineer, so I just thought it's important for me to say that. One of the things that is happening in the battery community is we think it's extremely important, especially for the things that you guys were talking about, the decadal and also the need to use vehicle to grid on an ongoing basis, to have batteries that can last many decades. So there is a lot of work going on in the battery community trying to understand why degradation occurs and how do we extend the life of these batteries. Probably the biggest challenge that we're facing is predicting the life of the batteries. So if something has to last 20 years and the applications are changing because we're suddenly going to V2G, which we were not doing in the beginning, then we don't quite know how degradation is going to be impacted by how we're going to use the battery. And nobody wants to wait 20 years to find out what the life is. So a big part of what we're doing is using tools like machine learning and artificial intelligence and user facilities at the labs to start to think about how do we take early data, accelerate some of the mechanisms, and try to see how to predict the life of these cells.
One of the concepts that was big about a decade ago was the idea of hot swapping batteries. And I guess that is sort of being reborn in China, where they're doing long haul trucking by swapping batteries. What is the status of that thinking in the United States?
At this point, and we've seen models for that as well in other countries. Israel is doing something similar, but there are so many duty cycles right now that are the first step for heavy duty EV that, we need to check off that first step as well. There's so many duty cycles that are under 200 miles per day. Every refuse truck in the United States, school buses we've already well talked about, drayage trucks going from ports of entry to distribution centers, very short miles. So, we're very focused, and I'm only speaking for Lion at this point, but we're very focused on active duty cycles. And as both of you know, our real focus is being able to hand keys to something, to a heavy duty vehicle, and have somebody drive it that day. This is not years away. This is going to fit into your operation today when we hand you the keys. And I know both of you have been handed keys and have driven our school bus here in Illinois. So I think that's our focus now, but I think in a long-term view, it will be part of our business plan to look at longer range vehicles.
Thank you. And I'll remind everyone that when we did a lap around your building, I just completely crushed Adam Kinzinger for the lap time. I just want 5 minutes for Mr. Kasten.
Yeah, let's make sure we have that on the record for posterity. With all respect to our colleagues, I love the fact that it's just Congressman Foster and I, because we really get to dig into the details and having these multiple rounds, and I appreciate taking the time. I have a big meaty question on the science and a big meaty question on economics, and I want to start with Dr. Srinivasan. I'm sorry, I keep struggling to pronounce your name. When 25 years ago, when I was working as a chemical engineer, the conventional wisdom was that the automotive sector was going to go from lead acid to nickel metal hydride. Lithium-ion was this interesting consumer electronics battery that didn't really have an application in the auto sector. And of course, thanks to all the technological resource, we've done that. We've also basically run down the periodic table, right? In chasing sort of higher mass densities, higher volumetric densities, we've gone from 200 molecular weight to whatever nickel is, 50 something, down to 3. Are we at a practical limit on mass weight densities with lithium ion? Is that simple characterization right? And then separately, should we be thinking about fundamentally different chemistries in grid-based applications where we don't have the same weight constraints as we think about how to optimize the supply chains?
Yeah, maybe I'll start off by saying we absolutely have a lot of room left with lithium-based chemistries. So we obviously have spoken a little bit about lithium-ion batteries, the fact that we have to remove cobalt and nickel. But if you now move towards the kinds of chemistries that we have broadly called solid state, which really is based on lithium metal, it fundamentally changes the energy density constraints that we're going after. It allows us to not only use lithium metal instead of using graphite, which allows us to increase energy density by a factor of 30 to 40%, but it allows us to go towards cathodes like oxygen and sulfur cathodes that are much higher energy density than today's sort of transition metal oxide chemistries. So if you look at raw numbers, and I'll be a little careful here because sometimes theoretical energy densities are not what practically one can get. But in theory, one should be able to get significantly higher energy density, maybe as much as an order of magnitude compared to today's lithium-ion. In practice, that's going to be very hard to do, only because these chemistries like oxygen and sulfur are very difficult to control. But we think there is a possibility of going somewhere between 2 to 2.5x energy density increase based on these new chemistries. So that's the first thing I'll say. The second one, and you hit on a very important point, which I think when we look at the grid, I was telling you some numbers before where we might end up requiring 5 terawatt hour or 10 terawatt hour of energy density for batteries for the grid. We need to think about a diversified set of supplies. And one important constraint we can remove is the energy density, volumetric and gravimetric. We don't have to worry about that. We have to worry a lot about, I think, multi-decadal lifetimes. The solar panel lasts 25 years. Your battery cannot be replaced every 8 years. We have to think hard about safety. It's going to be extremely important to have very safe batteries. So I do think that as we look at the grid, we have to start thinking about chemistries that are low cost, are based on, say, water-based, so that they're not flammable. And that's where I think some R&D really is needed for us to get to the kinds of chemistries that move away from lithium. Today, there is a tendency to use lithium for both applications, only because it's available. The economics is such that it's the one that makes the most sense. But I think we do have to start thinking about it from an R&D perspective, especially for applications which are on the grid side.
I want to pivot on my big meaty economics question, Mr. Baggio and Mr. Nevers. We're sitting here looking at this Competes Act that we're hopefully going to get through the Senate that's going to bring, $57 billion, something like that, to re-onshore domestic manufacturing. We're seeing a whole lot of companies who are saying, my lesson from COVID is these supply chains are too brittle. I need to bring more manufacturing back overseas. And we're seeing that in our economic numbers that for the last year and a half and for the foreseeable future, we're creating jobs a lot faster than we're creating workers. I don't know how that doesn't lead to significant wage inflation. And everybody who has a job is pretty excited about that. Everybody who has to buy things from people earning higher wages complains about that, right? And I'm wondering how you, as you look out at the sort of the economic landscape, do you see that how do we skin that cat? Do we basically say we're going to accept higher wages and therefore higher cost of consumer goods, and we're going to have a marketing solution how to fix that? Or are we going to say, this 30-year trend towards let's just offshore everything because it's cheaper regardless of the consequences, that we're not going to be able to subvert that? We think about that a lot in our job. How do you guys think about that tension?
Thank you for that simple question, Congressman. I would say we're trying to onshore as much as possible. And that means everything from battery production to vehicle production to charger production. I would also say that one thing Congress could help with would really be streamlining the visas for skilled workers. And there are a couple of reasons for that. Not just because you need someone for the job, but if you think of it this way, bringing in the right skilled worker might help keep more jobs in the U.S. So that's probably what we're looking to do, is to push for greater access to international workers that have the skills so we can onshore. So I think that's sort of a key enabler, is being able to bring in the skilled people so you can keep all the rest of the jobs here and onshore as much as possible.
Yeah, and I guess one component that maybe isn't real evident out there, but what we're trying to do is start earlier with the worker and work with STEM programs at the high school level and even middle school level in some cases. As you both know, the city of Joliet has the nation's oldest junior college in the United States. And we are working closely with them to identify that worker at a very early stage, because workers that are just now entering the workforce for the first time are very excited about EV. This is their reality, where it may not have been the reality for us on the panel here. But starting early, developing some of those skills, whether it's manufacturing, whether it's engineering, early on, and really creating that workforce and steering them towards us as opposed to other things, is part of a strategy that I think is going to work in this new exciting field.
And if I may, I can get back to you later on some of the details that we too are working with local universities on training.
I can add something very quickly. So not only do we start them young, but how the changes in the transportation industry is going to affect those who are already in the internal combustion engine. So how do you reskill workers? How do you provide that certificate programs? So a lot of people who've already been trained on one technology to then equip them to be able to move on to a different technology. And that's also an important part of the portfolio.
Thank you. Yield back.
No, if you talk about, the very, very non-applied research and, things like transformative chemistries, of all of the papers that you read coming in, what fraction come in from Europe, from the United States, from China, from Asia, the rest of Asia as a whole? And also what fraction of them are sort of hidden inside stealth mode companies? And so if you just sort of give a quick guess as to what, where when you read an interesting paper, where does it come from these days?
I guess I can start. So that's a tough question, and I do not have numbers. But I think when we read interesting papers in the battery industry, they come from everywhere now, not just the US. The US used to lead the number of innovations that came out, but that comes from everywhere in Asia, in China, in Europe also. So we can't, and that's a good thing. I think that's an important thing for the transition. If only the US transitions, we are still suffering from climate change problems. So the entire world has to transition together. But one thing that we have seen is that there have been greater investment in Asia and Europe on these technologies than we've seen here in the US, especially on kind of fundamental research and R&D. So that's where we need more support to actually allow, because we have world-class universities, we have world-class researchers that can bring in talent from everywhere. But how do we actually get them to work on battery and electrochemical related challenges?
Yeah. Compared to, say, social media startups or Wall Street.
I wouldn't blame them. Yeah, they pay more.
It's a cultural problem that somehow all the rewards in our economy go to the people with social media startups rather than the people that design the integrated circuits that make the whole thing possible. And the same thing is true of so much of our economy. That at the very end of the value chain, somehow that's where all the rewards come, and I struggle with that a lot.
And add some quick thoughts to that. I want to echo what Dr. Amanchukwu said. And if you go back 20 years ago, I used to be editor of a journal where most of the papers used to be from the United States, Japan, and maybe Europe. Today, it has changed pretty dramatically. There's a lot of papers from all over the world, especially from China. That's just the reality. And that has been happening as a trend every year for the last 2 decades, I would say. I will note, however, that when you look at the startup culture, it does feel like the United States still has that sort of this real entrepreneurial spirit where we see a lot of ideas, especially compared to Europe, where we see a significant amount of lower sort of, I would say, innovative ways of going after things and more of the sort of manufacturing. That's what we're seeing a lot more in Europe. So the US still continues to have that kind of that, sort of the entrepreneurial spirit where they're trying to take technology from lab to market. Now, my understanding is this is also increasing in Asian countries. There's a lot of emphasis there where we're trying to look at startups and new innovations. So I think we're going to see, or we are in a world where competition is worldwide. We are seeing a lot of different things that are happening. To the last point you made, Congressman Foster, I will note that in the last 2 years, something has changed in the battery industry. We are now seeing a tremendous, talent has become a huge issue, as we've all been talking about here. So we see a lot of people looking at the energy sector asking, is that a way for them to get to riches, especially in startups? We've seen a lot of these special purpose acquisition companies that have gone public, and there's been a lot of stocks that have been issued to these companies and to the employees. So we are seeing the beginnings of a trend where we see, I think, the earlier career people choosing energy over software and seeing the financial incentives are going in the direction. I don't know if that's going to be a long-term trend, but certainly something that looks encouraging.
And just to quickly add, and even those who are working on software for energy applications. So how do you use, if you look at an electric vehicle, it's software driven, right? Your battery management system, how do you predict battery lifetime, as Dr. Srinivasan mentioned? All of that is also using expertise that has been developed for artificial intelligence for deciding is it a cat or a dog? But those technologies can translate for materials discovery. And so there is that bubbling where students and young people are very interested in moving to energy storage or just sustainable energy in general.
Fascinating. And so, yeah, there is a lot of sort of shared intellectual space between, the study of how different proteins may bind together and the interactions when you get an ion inside a cathode anode. So it's a much more computational. It's not like old style thermochemistry where you got a big vat of this at this temperature doing something.
And thermochemistry did power and the Industrial Revolution. So it's played an important role in our energy transition.
Yeah, and I guess catalysts were always like that, where there was always microstructure to be understood. And that's anyway, I'm now down to 10 seconds, so I'll turn it over to
So the power of good staff, they're reminding me of areas that I should have followed up on earlier. Mr. Nevers, I understand, if my notes are right, that back in 2019, I think one of your colleagues answered the question that I was asking Dr. Srinivasan earlier. It said that over the life cycle, factoring in manufacturing and fuel use, that an electric vehicle was 40% lower CO2 emissions. I see you nodding your head, so hopefully that's jogging memory. I'm curious if that used the GREET models, and to what degree that assumption was based on a grid mix. And so as the grid cleans up, how much does that come down?
Right, well, thank you for the question, Congressman. I'll get back to you on the GREET model aspect.
Okay.
I'll have to get back to that. But I would point to a new study that came out last year from the International Council of Clean Transportation, and they actually revised those numbers. And now it's 60 to 68% more efficient than an ICE. And that, when you talk about fuel mix, that's life cycle. That's average life cycle in the U.S. So that includes battery development or battery production, vehicle production, and fuel. And that's marginal. That's a marginal delta to ICEs.
But I'm assuming you're making some assumption about the mix of fuels that form the power on the grid that you're using to charge that.
Yeah. So this paper came out last year, and it used a national average.
Okay.
And I could forward that paper to you. Interestingly enough, there was another study done just recently. I think it was the Center for Automotive Research and maybe Ford that showed that some of the larger vehicles like pickups, when you displace a gasoline pickup with a gasoline EV, you displace about 1.5 times more CO2 than the similar passenger car.
Mhm.
And why that's important for us is 70% of our customers are first-time EV buyers. So you're going at the market that really is the heaviest polluting chunk, if you will, in displacing those vehicles one at a time. Really, it's not just the 60%; it's the 1.5 on top of that.
Okay. And Mr. Baggio, I understand that you started your career as a bus driver. Do I have that right?
I did.
I'm assuming a diesel bus, probably.
Was a diesel bus. Yeah.
It's got to be kind of cool that you now have something without a tailpipe on it that you're taking out. Have you guys? We're talking about CO2, but shifting to the criteria pollution, there's no shortage of research that not providing idle diesel buses, especially in urban areas, not only health benefits but huge economic benefits because people live longer lives. And I'm wondering if anybody, and this could be for you given your history or any of the rest of you who thought through this, if we looked at what that offsetting economic gain that comes from not having the health costs of particulate pollution and everything else that comes with that out of the back of the idling school bus.
Yeah, I can tell you that I did start my career as a school bus driver, driving around in between my college courses, and it was a great job. Eventually, I became a general manager of large vehicle locations. So, at one point, I was in Los Angeles operating over 300 buses for the school district there, and you'd walk in at 6 in the morning, and you would have that many diesel buses starting all at once. All of your employees walking into that environment certainly affected our ability to keep people at work and health issues. And we're still really understanding what how magnified that was because of the environment and your mechanics and all those other folks. So there's certainly an impact. And when you walk into like a Twin Rivers school district in Sacramento, California, where they are well on their way to converting to all zero emission, the environment for the worker every morning and afternoon is very different from what I experienced in the mid 90s. There was also someone smarter than me, an 8th grader in the Miami-Dade school district, did a science project measuring diesel particulate inside the bus, outside the bus, in the classroom. And the worst air that her and her friends were breathing was inside that school bus going to school and going home. So there's impacts on health, there's impacts on learning, a lot of things that can be measured economically, certainly. So, making this transition to EV even more important.
Has anybody tried to quantify that? I mean, I spend a lot of time trying to get people to understand that we subsidize the fossil fuel sector in ways that distort capital allocation, that we get away from it. And, to the extent that Medicaid is subsidizing the diesel fuel industry, it distorts markets. I'm wondering, has anybody tried to quantify those numbers and figure out like what is the scale of that cost we are accepting as a society?
We have not done that at Lion Electric, but we do pay attention to nonprofits like CalSTART, the American Lung Association, the American Medical Association has done some things, but I haven't seen that, dollar for dollar, what are the impacts? There's certainly measurable statements in the, loss of life and things like that. So.
Thank you. If I may, Congressman, EPA is looking at a new round of rules 2027 and beyond for light duty and medium and heavy duty vehicles. This would be hopefully in the regulatory impact analysis. Having worked there before, it's real easy to put in zeros, and that's what you get for EVs. You put in zeros for pollution. So yeah, we don't have those numbers either, but we're really excited because we have a 100,000 unit contract or agreement with Amazon. And those are largely going to be displacing stop and go gas and diesel vehicles in some of these areas. So maybe that would be a good question for some folks over the EPA. What is the real world air impacts of electrification, especially some of the urban areas?
And I know I'm out of time, but I see Dr. Amanchukwu, so if Chairman Foster will allow, but welcome your response.
It's very quick. So the Energy Policy Institute at Chicago is doing that research on trying to quantify the impacts of pollution and how that can be used to further justify the electric transformation.
Okay. Thank you. And I will yield back.
When we talk about securing the supply chains, does that mean securing the supply chain in the good old US of A into North America, into the free democracies of the world? I guess, but where does Rivian and Lion Electric, where do you view a secure supply chain as coming from? How are you handling that in your strategic planning?
Obviously, in our near-term plan, there's still heavy dependence on cells coming from the Asian market in general. However, and again, to reiterate what an important topic is we're discussing today, but there's also efforts in Canada as we're opening battery manufacturing, working with both the province of Quebec and also Canada to identify mining sources that are going to feed that battery manufacturing. It is certainly part of our long-term goal, and also do that here in the US. We were looking at Joliet as strictly vehicle manufacturing, but we were really looking at probably having some battery manufacturing happening there as well to close that gap between the 20,000 vehicle capacity that we'll be building down the street versus the 17,000 vehicles that our battery plant will supply in the province of Quebec. So, again, it's a phased process. We have to go where the batteries are so we can get these vehicles into people's hands. But looking at a North American, Central American, even in some cases South American source has to be a part of our longer term plan.
And I would just add, we're all for, I guess they call it ally shoring, or leveraging existing diplomatic power if possible. And really that goes beyond just availability. It goes to sustainability and transparency. So as part of our mission, we wouldn't want to, and I don't want to speak, but I think we all agree, we don't want to outsource just to find out later that maybe there was an issue with said outsource because there wasn't transparency or it wasn't done in a sustainable manner. So to the extent we can onshore, that's great. And ally shoring, I think, is important. And I guess the question would be, back to the subcommittee, would be, is there a way we can develop allies with this strategic goal in mind? We've done it in the past, obviously. Look at different countries and why we're there. Why couldn't we do the same for these resources?
Yeah, and I think that you're right that that's something that government really has a role in. We have to decide where our incentives should apply to. Should they be the free democracies of the world, which would be my preference. I have to say I'm very impressed at the Biden administration's stance toward that. They're saying we have to make our economy, really not reliant on countries that we shouldn't be trusting from a strategic point of view or a human rights point of view. And the difficulty is how we set up the government incentives to make sure that you don't get your clocks cleaned by countries that offshore to cheap and abusive production facilities. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, we don't want to see this as a race to the bottom where companies are going to, as you mentioned, Chairman, to the basically the country with the lowest common denominator in terms of environmental or human rights.
To maybe make 3 quick points here. First is the Federal Consortium of Advanced Batteries, championed by the Department of Energy, that brings together DOE, DOD, Commerce Department, State Department, other agencies, is really thinking about a holistic view on how to have a secure supply, including the sort of collaborations with allied countries. That's the first thing I wanted to point out. The second point I wanted to quickly make is that for security, one needs a diversity of materials. So the problem with cobalt and graphite is that they're concentrated in one country. So, having materials that have a wider availability in the world, nickel, for example, is one of them actually, can provide us an opportunity to think about this from a secure way. The last thing I'll quickly point out is that as last year, the Argonne National Lab, along with the DOE and the Department of Energy, started a consortium called LiBridge, which is really aimed at bridging the supply chain gap. It's a public-private partnership, and part of the public-private partnership is looking closely at where is this road mapping exercise going to go, and which part of the world do we have those kinds of materials. So LiBridge will be talking to this FCAP group to sort of make sure that we are coordinating with the federal government so that we provide a view on what industry thinks the future is going to be and how the federal government may be able to help us as we go to that future.
Well, when you figure that out, let us know. It's one of, trying to optimize the federal subsidies for the right set of things is an ongoing challenge. Let's see, at this point, I am done with questions. Mr. Keston, do you have additional?
Well, I'll leave if maybe to put the question back to you all. You guys have been very generous with your time. This transition to clean energy broadly strikes me as being both enormously optimistic because all the transitions make us, we have more money in our pockets because we don't have to pay for fuels anymore. We have cleaner air. We're creating all these jobs. And pessimistic because it's creating a tremendous wealth transfer from those parts of the world that have depended on resource extraction to those parts of the world that depend on having access to cheap energy. And that should be easy, but there are politics involved there. There's a report I see out today that Blackstone has said that global decarbonization is a $50 trillion investment opportunity. And while the politics sometimes make it hard for government to lead, we can at least follow. And I'd love any closing thoughts that any of you have. If you were in our shoes, what would, given where capital is flowing, given how exciting and entrepreneurial this market is, if you could ask for one thing from the Congress to sort of fix and make sure that it flows in a way that delivers the kind of social outcomes we want, what would you like to see of us?
I'll start with that response. And I think a lot of what's happening or what we're seeing happening now, especially with the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, that we're seeing the federal government in an unprecedented way really take action for zero emission technologies. But what I would like to see, the ask would be to really curb funding for legacy fuels, fossil fuels. I think we've decided as a society which direction we're going and whatever we can do to get there faster. We're trying to overcome over 100 years of fossil fuel culture, and it is going to take that initial push. But at companies like Lion and others like us, we understand that this investment means we get our range up, we get our prices down, and not just achieve parity with the legacy fossil fuels, but improve upon that performance. So we would like to see continued unprecedented investment in this sector, but also holding us accountable to achieve that eventual goal of giving something back better to the society of the United States that performs better than what we've just settled for the last 100 years.
Right. Thank you for the question. It's really hard to pick, but I guess that my ask would be an easier one, and that is first, do no harm. And when it comes to, for example, discussions around adjusting the 30D tax credit, do not exclude those manufacturers that have orders, have customers expecting a tax credit. But if there are some changes to that credit or cap, it could really disincentivize future investment and future startups. So that would be my concern there with this first, do no harm on 30D.
Maybe I'll quickly say something that I said in my earlier remarks. So I view the energy transition as this two-pronged problem: a short-term, fill the supply chain challenge, get these batteries out there, get us into decarbonization as quickly as possible, but also a long-term, which will be the sustainable, carbon-free, the completely sustainable material supply, secure supply kind of a world. And that second one requires long-term R&D. The first one requires more, I would say, sort of combination of long-term and short-term R&D. And so having a steady ship that sort of lasts those 10, 15, 20 years where all of these are incentivized would probably be the most important thing for us to ensure that we're able to move the transition and so that we don't end up with some fit starts or where we go in one direction and then have to change direction again. So I would say that steady ship is probably the most important thing to think about.
Again, just echoing my earlier testimony, increased funding support for basic and fundamental science will always make the US ready for whatever transition goes. Once we have the fundamental and the basic research science happening here in the US and building talent. Talent is key. It doesn't matter any industry that comes. If you don't have the talent, you will not be able to sustain that. So I think that's those two things. I would cheat and ask for two things from the federal government. So increase funding for the NSF and the Office of Science at DOE and building talent especially. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And I guess I'll just close with agreeing violently with all of you, especially the last point. When you read one of those really impressive papers from someplace you've never heard of before, we want to be able to hire that person and bring them into the US. And if there's some student we want to, and we've trained them, we want to staple a green card to their PhD thesis. There's something that we're hoping to get into the Competes Act to really make that a permanent US policy, which would be transformative. And you know, we're about to reach the point where the total cost of ownership of electric vehicles will be less than internal combustion vehicles. And that was only possible because of decades of federally funded research and incentives to bootstrap the business. And I think we should remember that lesson, because it's only once we've convinced the world that zero emissions technologies are cheaper than fossil fuel technologies that we're going to be able to win the battle for climate change, not only in the United States, which can afford to decarbonize our economy, but in the rest of the world who are not going to want to burn fossil fuels because zero emission vehicles are cheaper. So I want to thank you all for your part in that battle. And with that, we're looking forward to the committee visit to Argonne National Labs, and we will be adjourned.